So this panel is, we're going to kind of talk about what's going on in copyright, mostly in the U.S. Yeah, come on up. We're a small group.
All of
yeah,
you.
we'll hang
just
out.
chat.
Should be a conversation.
little like seminar style discussion section.
No, it's okay.
Yeah,
Come in closer.
Okay, we got some people coming. We're waiting on one more panelist, but he'll be here in a few minutes.
Make sure it doesn't swallow him up first.
But so I kind of just figured we'd do an overview of what's been going on in Congress, what's been going on in the courts, what's been going on in the 7 different agencies that are talking about copyright and kind of want to get involved in the policymaking process, and other kinds of extra, outside of the government, voluntary stuff that's going on in the private sector. So I'm going to give all 3 of our panelists a few minutes to introduce themselves and their organization and kind of what their interests are in copyright reform. So start with Angelica.
Oh no, okay. Okay, my name is Angelica Das. I'm not sure if I should try and use this mic or not.
Can you guys hear us okay?
You can hear it? Okay,
If
good.
they're recording it, they're talking to them.
Oh yeah.
My name is Angelica Das, and I'm with the Center for Media and Social Impact at American University. I'm the associate director there, so I manage all of our research programs, and I also do primarily events and programming and curation in documentary film. So I just want to be clear to everyone that I have I am not a lawyer hat on always. These 2 can answer any questions that are meant for lawyers, I believe. So at the center, we're concerned with, along with public media and media for social impact, with intellectual property rights for creative communities. And so we, through the center's director, Pat Ofter-Heidi, and our colleagues at the law school, the Washington College of Law, Peter Yassi and his team, we've been working with creative communities for over 10 years on codes of best practices in fair use of copyrighted material. And our kind of hallmark community is documentary film. I'm also a documentary film producer, so I have that creative hat on. So our perspective is very much about know your rights. We think, this probably won't be news to you guys, but 76 Copyright Act very much skewed in favor of copyright holders. And so I think, our sense is that if there are any changes in the future, it's probably going to continue to go in that direction. But there is good news from our perspective, which is that we've had a lot of success working with communities in exercising their rights and limitations and free speech that's built into the law, namely in fair use. And since 1990, the courts have been really favorable for creative communities in exercising their fair use rights. And so it's led to this movement of creating these codes of best practices which the center has helped to kind of spearhead, and which has been instrumental in helping to organize professional practices in fair use, which is what judges primarily look for. Does anybody need any more of a background on fair use? I'm kind of assuming you guys have it, but okay, good. So the trends with the courts and with these codes of best practices and kind of organizing in communities have fostered, I think, pretty wide understanding of what fair use means. There's still a lot of work to do. We still encounter a lot of resistance, and that's why we come back to it. It's all about knowing your rights and exercising your rights, use it or lose it. But we think that there are rights worth defending, and we've seen it through the petitions to the DMCA. Filmmakers, students, professors, and the like have successfully petitioned the DMCA for exemptions, and that has really strengthened this exercise of the rights. So we just believe that exercising that balance in copyright law is essential for maintaining some kind of balance in the wake of potential stricter reforms in the future, and that's that's really the gist of it. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, that was awesome. Can I respond real quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, just two things. When I was characterizing voluntary measures before, a lot of times, I guess I was saying that in a negative kind of way, that voluntary measures are kind of outside of the law, but they're influencing the private sector to try to do more to filter and for DMCA takedowns, or to try to like restrict filtering on search engines or like YouTube and video sites like that, or try to do more around advertising. But on the flip side, there are a lot of things that can be that you can do voluntarily that really help creators, such as these best practices and fair use, which have as Angelica said, have a huge impact in the courts. I know that all now, like I'm actually an alum of the law school that works, and I had Peter Yazzie. So we I really name drop. We learned that all the, thanks to Dr. Heidi as well, her boss, that all of the major documentary filmmakers, insurance providers are now taking these letters that say that things are fair use. So you really can use voluntary things outside of the law to influence the law, especially in the courts and other kinds of practices. And the other thing is, when I rented my car this morning, the guy here, the guy who I was talking to him, he said, I mentioned that he asked what I did, and I said I'm an intellectual property copyright lawyer, and he said that don't a lot of other countries have less strict laws? And I was like, are you talking about like China? He's like, yeah, and I mentioned that in fact the U.S. laws actually have a lot of important exceptions that have allowed a lot of innovation to flourish here, thanks to the fair use doctrine, both for things such as search and VCRs and a lot of other things that restrict the scope of copyright to promote innovation. But I'll let Michael talk more.
Well, I can add to it a little bit. I just wanted to, flexible and adaptable is what we like to say when it comes to exercising fair use, and I think that it applies to other limitations in the law as well. So just to add on to the E&O insurance, that was a huge deal for documentary film. There's literally millions of dollars that's been saved in rights clearances thanks to the use of the statement of best practices and fair use. And if you think about what E&O insurance means, it's, which I actually just cleared my film for this as well, so I use the statement of best practices myself, and so I can say this from personal experience. Insurance is about risk, right? And so if they're accepting fair use claims, it's basically saying that there is no risk for these insurers to take on those claims. So that's a huge deal. And I have lots more examples, but I think that the basic gist is that creators are making new work thanks to being able to exercise this right.
I have my own.
Oh, you have, right. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me out here. So I'm Michael Weinberg, and I work with an organization called Public Knowledge, and we are a nonprofit digital rights consumer advocacy group. We focus on technology policy that generally breaks down into two categories. We have a whole kind of network connectivity side of the house that's very busy doing net neutrality work right now. And then we have this whole IP side of the house, which is very copyright focused. And I think historically, as an organization, we really can trace our roots back to copyright activism. We were born a couple years after the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was passed, in no small part because that was a law that set a lot of the terms for how copyright worked on the internet. And it was largely an agreement between many large rights holders and a few tech companies, but not a lot of consumers and public interest voice. And at least some of the shortcomings in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, can be traced back to that original design flaw, which is that when it was being negotiated, there was not strong advocacy for public interest. And so when we think about copyright, I think everyone up here will talk a lot about balance, and I think balance is an important thing. But yeah, we have been advocating for small and large scale reforms to the copyright regime for almost 15 years now. And I think we're in a process now that's very exciting because in Washington terms, it's starting to heat up. It's still going to be a process. But we're going to talk a lot about problems with the 76 Act, and one of the obvious problems is that it was made before the internet. But I think there's a larger problem, a problem that's a little bit more core, which is that the 76 Act didn't really envision copyright as a popular thing, and popular in the sense that just everyone was going to be touching it and engaged with the system. And so while there's a diverse set of problems with the current copyright system, many of them can be tied to the fact that it's just not designed for the masses, for sort of non-professionals to be engaged with it. But because of the way that it's structured, everyone is forced to engage with it. And so to reconcile those two things requires making a number of compromises and a number of changes. And so while there are many things that we're thinking about in terms of copyright reform, that's one of the watchwords, one of the guiding principles, that if this is going to impact everyone, we need to kind of recognize that and treat it accordingly.
That's another great point. We're still waiting for our third panelist, who should be coming in any minute now. But I guess I can briefly just say who I am. I don't know if it's my
for recording.
the recording. Hello. So I'm Ally Sternburg, and I'm policy counsel at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA. We're a trade association of internet, tech, and telecom companies that for more than 40 years has been promoting open competition, open systems, open networks, and open innovation. And copyright is an issue that really affects our members and we really care about. And some of our, we've been taking part in a lot of the PTO and NTI roundtables. One of my coworkers has participated in copyright roundtables as well on making available orphan works, the DMCA roundtables, licensing, a lot of different. We try to participate in as many things as possible so that our members' voices can be heard. And we also file a lot of amicus briefs in fair use cases. The next month we'll be filing in the latest Google Books appeal and Capitol Records versus Vimeo, which deals with some of the principles from Viacom versus YouTube, the safe harbors, and also federalizing pre-1972 sound recordings. And we also try to participate in the conversations around IP and trade agreements, trying to make sure that there's balance in those as well, trying to export more of the U.S.'s safe harbors and limitations and exceptions like fair use. It's kind of our interest. Well, I guess we can just start off with some questions. I'm going to probably ask some questions, and anyone from the audience is welcome to ask questions at any point. And so, all right. So where do you want to start? I guess both of you have mentioned this 1976 Act and kind of where that needs to go. So we can talk a little bit about the legislative process that's going on right now. They've had several. They're actually in the middle of a hearing right now on the first of two hearings on music licensing, the House Judiciary Committee, IP subcommittee, and anything that you guys want to talk about this current comprehensive review of different copyright provisions that the House Judiciary is doing and the Senate may start doing, and like how likely that might lead to reform anytime soon and the next great Copyright Act. Anything you guys want to say about the legislative involvement? Go for it.
Yes, I have to be all here.
Yeah, I can set, so there's sort of, I can set the stage a little bit more broadly. There are, if you were to be uncharitable, you might call them three rings of process right now in terms of reforming the Copyright Act. And these are encouraging because for a long time there were no rings, and now there are three rings, but it is a little bit unclear how they all fit together. So one ring is the House Judiciary Committee, which is doing kind of a top to bottom review. That is the committee where copyright lives. It's doing a top to bottom review of the current Copyright Act, hopefully in anticipation of a major redrafting. And that's something that's happening. They're basically doing hearings they're aspiring to do hearings every 6 weeks or so that basically walk their way through the act and say, okay, how's this working, how's this working, how's this working? That's a process that's about halfway done right now and will be hopefully fully done early next year, which will then have gathered a lot of information about thinking about going forward. You have another ring, which is administrative or quasi-administrative agencies, and that is that the Copyright Office is doing its own review of the various parts of the Copyright Act, and then the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, which does not have copyright in its name, but is also doing a review of copyright. And I think that it's fair to say that the Copyright Office and the PTO are jockeying for position to be the expert agency on copyright as part of this process. So there's a little bit of a competitive process between those two for trying to be the most legitimate and to use the most of everyone's time as humanly possible. And then there's also this third ring. Is this third ring of what's happening in the courts. And that's obviously less geared towards thinking about reforming copyright the law as it is written, and more about trying to kind of explore where it actually exists. And so that's happening. It's an ongoing process with any number of cases. But with the court section aside, although it is very important, there are these kind of three elements in Washington, all of whom recognize or at least pay lip service to the fact that the current copyright system is broken, and are jockeying to be the kind of thought leaders, to use a horrible term, which they would all love to be used, to refer to them, to be the thought leaders on how this goes forward. And so one of the challenges for people who are interested in copyright reform is, especially if you are moderately to under-resourced, is figuring out how real any of these three processes are and how much time you can spend with them. Because at some point it kind of goes from let's learn about this stuff to let's start doing and let's start drafting. And it can be a challenge on this side of that switch to know what's going to be influential and what's just a lot of kind of log rolling. So that's where we are on all of that. I think they're all processes that exist in greater or lesser efficiencies, but they're all kind of moving in the same general direction. I suspect that everyone involved has preferences as to who should be the lead for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. That's where we are right now. At least that's my sense of where we are.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I especially thought that was a really good point about being about that there's a limited amount of resources and time, and so not only is the House Judiciary IP Subcommittee holding hearings about every 6 weeks, the PTO, NTI, DMCA roundtables are every 6 weeks. They've been alternating between DC and the West Coast, and it's definitely challenging and expensive to have to dedicate that amount of time to participating. So it ends up being a lot of DC lobbyists rather than the actual people that are the actual creators or actual people from the companies who know how these systems work. So it's definitely going to be a challenging process. And the other thing is about under-resourced people and wanting to make sure that the public interest is heard. If there's one thing that there's a lot of things we learned, but one of the major lessons from SOPA drink is that the public interest really has to be at the table, and in copyright discussions, and for so long it hadn't been. Still waiting on Ryan. So I want to hear more from Angelica about fair use. So you can just talk about something else that you haven't talked about yet.
Well, can I just open it up? I'd like to hear what's on your guys' mind. Why did you come here today? What issues are important to you?
So in terms of fair use, I guess this is a little bit from personal experience. My little brother is an electronic music producer. And I think one of the biggest issues that I see is kind of this selective enforcement. He gets a takedown notice, once a song hits 10,000 plays. I question whether more prominent artists actually have licenses to sample their work. And so I kind of feel like there's this unfairness in how,
He's not a toddler DJ, is he?
No. He's like a full-grown adult. Yeah.
I'm kidding.
I have a JD and he's a DJ. So.
Yeah, we get those questions a lot. So I'm not a lawyer, but generally speaking, first of all, those takedowns are bot run, so they're not
BOT.
Yeah.
Bot, yes,
BOT.
BOT.
Blocked by someone.
So, largely, I mean, I realize I'm making a generalization there, but I think chances are. So, I think nine times out of 10, when you push back on that, they're going to grant you the access, and so that's again where we sort of repeat ad nauseum. Know your rights. Don't hesitate to push back. And while we may be a little bit cynical about the potential for copyright reform, we're greatly indebted to places like Public Knowledge who are taking on this thought leadership, as you said, because we do still hold out some hope, and there are people out there, but again, it's about we all have to educate ourselves, and which is reminding me that I need to be paying more attention to the legislative process as well. But I'm getting a little bit off topic because what you're asking is, so essentially, what's the actual?
Well, I don't know. I just wanted to kind of open up. Like, I see a little bit of a problem in the way that.
Right. So the chances that your little brother or really any of us are actually going to get sued, I promise you, are minuscule. These
This
people
is the non-lawyer.
This is the non-lawyer.
Okay.
I have successfully labeled myself as the non-lawyer.
You can safely make that statement.
I am allowed to say that. Yes, I am. I mean, I think that the precedent does support that individuals aren't going to be attacked that way. Also, because the takedowns are automatic, that you do have the ability to push back and say, no, I actually have a right to do this. And the more you can back yourself up, and this is what I think is inherent in all of the codes of best practices. Just so you know, the different communities that we've worked with, I mentioned documentary film because that's our kind of hallmark work, but we've worked with poets, dance archivists, journalists, research librarians. We're currently working with artists and art scholars, the media literacy educators. The list kind of goes on. And there are communities that are taking on kind of defining these professional practices outside of even our work. So kind of inherent in those best practices is that, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I think you get the idea. Is that helpful at all?
It's actually, it's interesting. I use this kind of example in another whole different universe of my work a lot, which is that, if you're an artist who is, broadly defined a remix artist, someone who's sampling, who's doing a lot of sampling, there's this drag on your work because when you do whatever you're going to do, you then have this calculus you're dealing with.
It's self-censorship.
Right. Well, it's self-censorship a little bit, but it's also just sort of, it reduces your ability to create because you create this work and you kind of have this decision, right? Am I going to not distribute it very widely because I hope to slip under the radar? Or am I going to try and distribute it so widely and become so popular that no one will dare challenge my use of this? Or am I going to get stuck in this middle area where I'm spending all my time worrying about copyright clearance or not needing copyright clearance instead of worrying about how to make my art and my music better? And it's just sort of the systemic problem where you're being forced to do that. And even the process of electing, to the extent you can elect, which one of those slots you want to be in, means that you're not spending time doing what you care about, and you're spending time worrying about this very obscure legal calculus. It doesn't make a lot of sense for you to be engaged with very much.
That was very well put. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Ryan.
Welcome to the country.
So we've both done some introductions and kind of taken a few questions, but we'll let you jump in and talk a little bit about yourself and your organization and your interest in copyright right now.
Sure. Thanks, and appreciate it. Ali and CCIA for putting together this panel. So I work at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We're a public interest group that approaches public policy from a more classical libertarian perspective, which obviously makes things interesting on copyright in that among libertarians you have those who despise copyright and those who love copyright. My organization happens to be one that appreciates copyright, but we also see it as perhaps not a perfect law as it's currently written. And we recognize that there's sort of no pure, perfect amount or method of copyright that's handed down from nature, and it's up to policymakers to figure out the metes and bounds of copyright as with other rights. So I've been working on this issue for many years, and with Ali and with Mike and their organizations. We take as I said, somewhat more pro-copyright stance in that the degree to which we think the act should be reformed is not nearly as significant as some would push. Of course, we recognize that there are areas that need to be reformed. As you probably talked about, the House Judiciary Committee has been hosting a series of hearings, both in D.C. and in other parts of the country, where Sherwin just testified, Michael's colleague, about a number of interesting major issues. So just to start out with one, and where we come down is digital first sale. It's the question whether a digital copy of a lawfully made work can be resold in the same way as a physical copy, a book, a DVD, something like that. Right now it's unclear under the Copyright Act, under Section 109, whether a digitally made copy can be sold. The reason is because the first sale doctrine only limits the distribution right, not the reproduction right. So to say that in plain English, the problem with selling a digital work is that it generally involves reproducing the work. There are some companies like Redigi that say that they've been able to figure out a way to sell a digital copy of something like an iTunes song without actually reproducing it, such that the song never exists in two places at once. And maybe that's true. However, a lot of the works that are currently being sold are actually not copies. When you buy a song, you're not really buying a copy, you're buying a license. This may be a license that lasts as long as you do. It probably isn't transferable, although in some cases it is, or at least on a limited basis. But to me, the key issue from the digital first sale is that even if we agree that true copies that are conveyed can be sold, we should also respect licensing terms that are restrictive, using the same principles that we use otherwise when we're figuring out whether a contract is enforceable. So if you just have a notice, the classic cases on first sale deal with whether you are placing a notice on a book that says this isn't yours, you can't transfer it, is good enough to limit your ability to resell that work. And the Supreme Court says no. On the other hand, if you have one of those long contracts that nobody reads, where you click I agree, and one of the terms is you can't transfer this, that probably should be enforced, at least if you have an opportunity to read the contract and accept it before you purchase the work. So that's one issue that the House Judiciary Committee is looking at. There are a number of others. One is the whole issue of how to enforcement. There's this concern that a lot of the rights holders have expressed, that there's rampant infringement online. If you type in a Google search for song name and MP3, a lot of the links will be infringing, although Ali's colleague Nat has demonstrated in a CCIA study that there's not necessarily as much of a correlation, and that in fact there's a lot the rights holders could do to bring their links up. But there's been a lot of discussion of both search engines and also websites that just don't respond to takedown notices. Back in the day we called these rogue websites. Unlike in previous years when legislation was actually being pushed unsuccessfully, fortunately, there's not currently a real legislative push to change the Copyright Act to improve enforcement. Rather, what we're seeing is sort of first pressure from rights holders, both in hearings. You'll see representatives from both small creators and representatives from the big AAs, MPA, RIAA, talk about how enforcement isn't good enough, how actors in the internet, big companies need to do more. So we've seen voluntary initiatives emerge over the last couple of years. One notable one is the Center for Copyright Information's copyright alert system. The idea is that if an ISP receives information that one of its subscribers is sharing a copyrighted work on a file sharing network on BitTorrent, that a notice can be sent to that user that will tell them, hey, you're committing infringement. Maybe you're not aware of it, but just FYI, maybe it's a teenage kid of the person who's paying for the internet connection. Maybe it's a neighbor who's using your unsecured wireless network. So the idea of this system is to first to promote awareness among people if they're infringing. In many cases, people know exactly what they're doing. They know they're infringing. They don't necessarily want to infringe, but they want to get work for a lower price than what's being offered. So maybe the notice isn't going to do a lot. So there's this report that was just released that showed that something like a third of every subscriber who received the initial notice received a subsequent notice. So you could call that the recidivism rate if you assume that these are accurate, which they probably are to a large extent, although there's possibility for misuse. Over the coming years, I think we'll see more of these voluntary initiatives because the legislative will does not exist to push anything that ramps up enforcement, unless it's, I think, bundled with reforms that address some of the overreaches of copyright in a number of areas. The natural path for those who care about enforcement, it will be to continue to try to hash out these voluntary deals. In general, we like voluntary deals, at least as supporters of transactions between consenting parties without the force of government as an alternative and as a way to augment state action. However, there is the challenge that when members of Congress, when hearings are being used to threaten companies into compliance, we might see voluntary regimes emerge that are not truly voluntary. Although so far, I don't think that's been the case. The major stakeholders that have been participating, the internet service providers, the big US ISPs, your Comcast, Time Warner Cable, AT&T, and so forth. And on this internet side, your companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook. I don't see them as being easily strong-armed by rights holders to participate in these systems that are problematic. So there is, I think, a dynamic where both sides see something to gain, both from a perception perspective and from the perspective of actually channeling people toward legitimate works, which is how content ought to be consumed, even if those who sell it lawfully don't always do so in the most economically rational ways. The way that you cause them to be more rational is not through letting their works be infringed, because it's hard to compete with a distributor that can sell access to copyrighted works with no cost other than the bandwidth. It's difficult. There are ways to do it, of course, but if you have that dynamic, you're going to push the price down to the point where a lot of the content that we enjoy today won't get produced, which is due to the failure of markets. So those are a few of the issues that the House Judiciary is looking at, the policymakers are looking at, and that are going on that we're following, and where we stand.
Thank you. Yeah, you actually, we hadn't raised any of those issues about first sale or digital first sale or kind of the windowing and competing with piracy in the market. So those are some great points. Thanks. Michael, did you want to respond to anything that Ryan raised?
Yeah, I want to sort of flag one thing and probably respond to one thing. The flagging one thing is on the digital first sale front. I think that this is, whether or not you kind of are focused on it as an issue, it's really indicative of one of the reasons why copyright reform generally is so important. Because one of the things that we are seeing as you transition into a kind of a mostly digital, all digital world is that it gives, first of all, it increases opportunity for distribution in all sorts of ways, which is great. But it also gives rights holders an ability to control uses that extend significantly beyond what they historically were allowed to do, or you're just able to do. And you see that, the difference between selling and licensing is an obvious example. And if you think of copyright as a very elaborate series of balances between users and rights holders and creators, one of the things that happens as you transition into the digital world is that balance shifts significantly. And in many ways, it shifts towards rights holders at the expense of traditional rights of end users. And so one of the reasons, and it may be that shift is worth it, right? The benefits of digital are worth giving up all these rights that we as users have had historically. But one of the things that you have to really worry about is that's an assessment you need to actually do with your eyes open. One of the problems is you wake up one day and you realize you've lost all these things without even realizing it. And so when you're thinking about reapproaching copyright law and redoing copyright law or revising copyright law, one of the important parts of the exercise is just to recognize what has changed on the ground in the market. And if that change means that it's time to change the structure of the law, maybe to restore some of the balance that we used to have. I think you can come down on different places in that analysis, in that argument, but it's a really important analysis to do. It's a really important argument to have at a minimum. And the other short thing that I will say is on the voluntary agreements, and this isn't fair to Ryan, but I'm going to do it anyway, is that when I was explaining public knowledge at the beginning before you were here, I said we were born a lot out of policy discussions that existed around the DMCA, especially between large rights holders and large tech companies, and that's where there's a problem with the DMCA. There's a problem there, and I think that Ryan's description of private agreements highlights a similar dynamic, right? You see an agreement between large rights holders, and whether or not you think that when the White House pulls everyone into a room that is government coercion or not, between large rights holders and large tech companies and telling them, or just them deciding themselves, you need to make a deal. And the natural result of that dynamic, the logical result of that dynamic, is that they cut a deal that makes sense for the people who are in the room, who are parties to that discussion, which is the large tech companies and the large rights holders. But the people who get left out of that are users, are everyone else. And as is obvious from my description of the DMCA process, going through a legal and a statutory process does not necessarily resolve that. But our hope is, and one of our operating theories is, today, with the existence of all sorts of groups that care about copyright reform that could not be slotted into either large rights holders or large tech companies, going through the legislative process forces it to be more inclusive in a way that private agreements often will not be. And so at a minimum, it increases the likelihood that whatever bargain is come to is not a bargain that only works for the largest players. And so when we think about private agreements, we're very anxious about them generally, because they do have a tendency to reduce the rights of end users for expediency between the largest players. Sorry.
I just wanted to add on the eyes open piece of this, which is what I was alluding to earlier when I lost my train of thought, which is that kind of inherent in the codes is understanding why you're using the copyrighted material. And that's a huge part of fair use, and where we found people to be the most successful is when you have really clearly justified reasons for why you're using it. And so even someone like your little brother should be able to explain pretty clearly why this is a transformative work, and maybe he doesn't use the word transformative, but why it's a new creative work and why it's not just a copy of the original. And that's something that we're all capable of doing.
Thanks. Oh, question.
I just have a question. I think it's a topic you haven't brought up yet, but in the current climate and thinking about copyright reform, kind of what's the current status of thinking about term extensions? And the old joke that whenever Mickey Mouse is about to be in the public domain, Congress comes to the rescue and extends copyright. Is the current feeling, do you think there's going to be another term extension before this is all said and done, or is the current feeling more like that, at this point 100 years of copyright protection is probably enough and we don't need more? I won't get into if we need less because I'm a little realistic.
I mean, I know that was one of the, there hasn't, that hasn't been one of the topics that they've had a hearing on yet, but they did have, well, actually the first hearing that they had before they started going through the Act, like 101, 106, was they had a hearing with just Maria Palante, the Register of Copyrights, and she had given a talk at
Columbia
on the Next Great Copyright Act, and one of the things she did raise was that was kind of got a lot of attention was around term and whether it wasn't reducing term. I think it was some formalities towards the end of some like special things we had to comply with, like re-registering toward the end of the term to get the last 20 years. So that actually was one time when a reduction, sort of a reduction, or at least not an extension, was on the table. But I haven't heard people. I know the 2018 is when finally things will be coming into the public domain again, and I guess that's in a couple of years. I haven't been hearing about it, but any of you guys have more insights on how likely that seems? Or are you pessimistic, optimistic? What do you think?
I don't think the copyright term will be extended in the foreseeable future. I would bet money on that. There may be a push. I don't think it'll be a powerful push. If it happens, it will fail unless, absent some unforeseeable change in circumstances. The will to extend terms yet again, I don't think is there. On the other hand, I think it's more likely we may see some formalities re-added to the Act. We've bound ourselves through international treaties to life plus 50 with Berne, and then with other agreements, life plus 70. So unfortunately, reducing terms is limited by those treaties, but also the formalities are also in international commitments. However, there are ways where the reintroduction of formalities is permissible currently on a limited basis. Things like making statutory damages contingent on renewal and registration after a time, for at least for domestic works would be acceptable, and perhaps for foreign works as well. But I don't think they're going to increase terms. It's unlikely. The only way it would happen, to get back to what I said earlier, is if it's part of a broader package that includes things like formalities. But even then, I don't think terms would be part of that. At least increasing terms probably wouldn't be part of the deal.
Yeah, I think it's getting increasingly hard to explain as a rights holders why you need additional term, especially if you're looking at copyright as, an incentive to create. And the study that I have always wished someone smarter than me would do, which I bring up at every event possible in case you in the audience are that person, is what I really would love to see is a study of things like advances in, or payments for scripts or whatever it is, from whether those jumped significantly from 1996, 1997 to 1999, 2000, when this additional 20 years got tacked on the end of copyright, right? Was the discounted present value of that last 20 years of protection worth anything at the time that the rights were being acquired? My suspicion is the answer is it was worth nothing already, but I'm not an economist, I can't do that study. But yeah, so I think, if you're thinking about this realistically, I would agree, no more extension. And the question is, but could we get to a place where we roll it back? And there is this sort of thicket of treaties, international treaties are international treaties. We can deal with them as we see fit to some degree. You don't go to international treaty jail if you violate them. But yeah, I think that, people who are talking about a quote unquote realistic rollback within the scope of treaties, the easy ask, relatively easy ask, is something where in order to get the last 20 years of protection, you have to register your work. You have to make just some effort to get it. And so if you don't do that, it may be that you are still technically protected by copyright, but not a whole lot happens if your rights are violated. And what that means is the Mickey Mouses of the world, they can register, Disney can register, they have their act together, they have their legal department, they can do it, but a work for whom any rights holder are long since gone, all of a sudden, if they don't fully enter the public domain, they at least enter a place where they are not as scary for people to use. And that's, well, part of me says, why can't we just roll it back to something shorter? Part of me recognizes that every single Copyright Act since the first one has increased term. And so even stopping extensions would be a major victory, and stopping extensions plus kind of half rolling back would be a fundamentally different thing in the history of copyright. And so that's the deal that seems to be slowly coming together. It's a deal that you would hope large rights holders wouldn't object to because they are set up to re-register. It's not really a lot of weight for them, but we'll see.
On the other hand, I believe the vast majority of works that are orphaned, where you can't identify a rights holder, and so if you use it, you're at risk of litigation. I believe that most of those are orphaned well before that last 20-year period kicks in.
Well, I think they're orphaned within 10 years of creation. Yeah.
Right. So it's not clear that registration for the last 20 years does a whole lot, other than sort of set the principle that formalities are back, which is I guess a good principle to set.
And two more quick things on the term extension. There is a bill right now called the Respect Act that would be about one part of the federalizing pre-72 works. It wouldn't bring a lot. It wouldn't also include like TNCA protection for service providers. It would really just be for radio. It's very limited to sound recordings. But that one point about that was like, oh, that protection is really gonna incentivize like people to make more pre-72 sound recordings, right? Like just like
finally
dead people. Like, and the other thing was with older works. Staying in copyright is one of those two copyright Supreme Court cases this term was Petrello, which dealt with latches and kind of how long you can wait to sue on a work. So like the longer that things stay in copyright, the more risk there could be for using works. But I only mentioned that so we can talk about the other Supreme Court copyright case this term because we haven't talked about Aereo, and I know that's a case that a lot of people are thinking about because the opinion is very likely to come out sometime this month. So, do you guys have any like predictions or thoughts on Aereo?
Do you want to set up Aereo a little bit?
Oh, so sure, I guess I can do that. So, the case is called ABC v. Aereo, and it was argued toward the end of April, but which was one of the last cases of the term. But most people think it's going to come out this term. And the case deals with a service called Aereo, which allows subscribers to the service to watch TV on like the free available broadcast TV that they can get in their area on computers, on tablets, on mobile phones, and using devices like Chromecast or Roku to connect it to their TV. And it's based on this principle from a 2008 case in the Second Circuit in New York called Cablevision, and it relies heavily on that doctrine and says that so each subscriber has their own antenna, and when it's just that one-to-one using their own antenna, it means that it's a private performance rather than a potentially infringing public performance. So that's the main argument that a lot of people tried to make was that it's private performance and so it's not infringing. But the argument gets into some fair use arguments based on Sony Betamax case. It also sometimes gets into a lot of telecom policy around retransmission fees, and so there are a lot of interesting things that were raised in the briefs in an oral argument, and a whole lot of amicus briefs that were filed, including us, and I think Point Knowledge filed, and I don't know if you guys filed, but so it's definitely a case that a lot of people have been watching because it has the potential to really affect this just the broader cloud-related industry and just a lot of the innovation that's relied on this Cablevision doctrine. We sponsored a study a couple years ago showing how much too. There was one in the U.S. showing how much VC funding and like has gone into services relying on Cablevision, and then another one showing how that was not the same in Europe because they don't have the same Cablevision precedent. So that's basically the case. I don't know if you guys want to weigh in.
Sure. So, I mean, why does Aereo matter? You know, on one level, it matters because it's sort of another test of this "how long is your wire" test, where the question is, okay, so you are allowed to record over-the-air TV at home on your TiVo or on your computer or on whatever, with an antenna connected to your house. Well, you know, let's say the antenna is in your living room. That's okay. Let's say the antenna is on your roof. That's also still okay. Let's say the antenna is like down the street. Still okay. Let's say the antenna is in a warehouse on the other side of town. It's still one antenna, it's still your antenna, it's just further away. Is there a point at which the length of the wire fundamentally changes the copyright calculus? We would argue no. And then there's this larger question there are many larger questions. There's another question that still has something to do with TV, but has a lot to do with cloud services more generally, where this public-private performance distinction is relevant because one of them triggers a copyright analysis and one of them doesn't. Right? A public performance is a much bigger deal from a copyright standpoint than a private performance. And so the question is, if I have uploaded something to a cloud service, or I am getting something from a cloud service, is that a public interaction that might trigger a copyright analysis? Or is it a private interaction, which is like, it's the same as if it was on my hard drive or on my shelf or whatever it is. And I think that if you side with Aereo, you say these are all private, right? There's no difference between me storing a document on my laptop or on a thumb drive or on a virtual slice of my hard drive that happens to be on a server somewhere else. And one of the things that is hard about Aereo, and we're supporters of Aereo, but I think this is true, is that the courts kind of don't like Aereo, the service. They just think it's bad. But they recognize that the deal with copyright law is it applies to everyone. And if you think that copyright law should work the way that it is written, it's hard to find a way to find Aereo illegal, which is not a surprise. Aereo was constructed to be strictly in compliance with copyright law. And so the question that is the meta question that's facing the court is, do you dislike the business model of Aereo enough to totally skunk entire areas of copyright law? Or are you willing, if you, the court, decide that Aereo is a illegitimate business model, to kind of hold your nose to maintain the integrity of copyright law? With that framing, it's not a surprise. I hope that they hold their noses. I don't think they should have to hold their nose, but I think they're going to hold their nose and agree with it, as opposed to skunking entire areas of copyright law. But which way they actually go.
I'll jump in. I wrote a brief on Aereo with Jeff Manny of the International Center for Law and Economics. We took the opposite position. We think Aereo is infringing. If they actually were just a warehouse and they ran a wire to your house across town and there was an antenna and they sold that to you, that was all they did, I don't think Aereo would be infringing. The problem is they built a business where they do a lot more than just rent you an antenna and connect a wire to your house. They have this fancy array of tiny antennas. They pull the content over the air. They
have an antenna?
They have an antenna.
That receives things.
It receives things. Then
that works.
Yes.
And they sell it to you.
Well, no, and they also have a server platform where they distribute it over the internet and assemble it with
IP wires.
They use IP wires.
Okay.
They offer the DVR functionality,
which is legal.
Which it's unclear.
Do you have a DVR at home? Do you pay a licensing fee for it?
Yes, that's legal.
You pay a licensing fee for your DVR at home?
Actually, no, it's a rental fee for the physical object.
Yes, but
I
you
think
do not
it's-
pay.
No, I may be committing copyright infringement when I use my DVR.
Okay.
It's unclear.
Sorry.
It is unclear.
I want to say one last real quick thing, which is that we're about to publish best practices for orphan works, so please keep an eye out for that.
Okay.
cmsimpact.org.
And, sorry to cut you off. We can continue this discussion over there. As you can see, copyright is really exciting. And thank you so much to all of you for coming to listen to us. And we'll stop taking up the time of the next panel. But thank you very much to everyone at CFP. Thanks.